Senator Sanders. He said this week that he's spoken with you in the last few days.
Yes.
So that one's accurate.
Okay. That's right.
That's good. What's your relationship like with Senator Sanders? You obviously share a lot of important policy goals, but some differences, and you've been competitors over these last few months.
Yeah.
What's your relationship with him?
So Bernie and I have been friends for a long, long time. Dating back way before I ever got involved in politics. Through the housing crash in particular, kind of here were central issues we were working on. I came up, in fact, the first town halls I've ever done were in Vermont. Were for Bernie Sanders.
Wow.
And Bruce drove me up on a Saturday and we did a couple of town halls. But it's a set of issues we've worked on, both of us, for a very, very long time. And I respect that.
That is usually grounds for mutual trust, or at least mutual understanding when you've had a long relationship like that.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I wanted to ask you about that relationship with Senator Sanders is something that I talked to him about last night when I was in Vermont. And that is that there have been some really untoward attacks by Senator Sanders' supporters, not by him himself, against you. Particularly online. His supporters have called you a snake. They used the snake emoji for you. They've called you a traitor. They tried to organize somebody to primary you, to force you out of your Senate seat here in Massachusetts. And the senator said last night, he responded, he said, I condemned that. And he's distancing himself from what his supporters have done. But I wanted to ask if that rose to your level of consciousness, if you were aware of that was going on, if you have any reaction to that or to his comments about it last night.
You know, it's not just about me. I think there's a real problem with this online bullying and sort of organized nastiness. And I'm not just talking about who said mean things. I'm talking about some really ugly stuff that went on. You know, out in Nevada, when the Unite Here had put out an analysis of the different candidates and their views on healthcare and other issues. And some of the Bernie supporters online took exception to it. And they didn't just take exceptions, like, we disagree, and, you know, outrageous way to do this, which anybody can do. That's fine. And you can be clever, and you can find clever ways to be kind of mean sometimes. Okay, I get that part too. But they actually published the phone numbers and home addresses of the two women, the executive director, the communications director, women of color, immigrant women, and really put them in fear for their families. These are not, you know, these are tough women. Tough women who've run labor organizing campaigns and really earned their jobs in their union, I mean, the hard way. And yet said for the first time, because of this onslaught of online threats, that they felt really under attack. And that wasn't the first time it happened. Working Families Party, two women there, women of color, who were attacked right after they endorsed me. And I think this fundamental question about what goes on online and where those lines are and how much each of us, and I want to say this for all of the candidates back when there were lots of us, we are responsible for the people who claim to be our supporters and do really threatening, ugly, dangerous things for two other
And it's
candidates.
a particular problem with Sanders' supporters.
It is. I mean, and it just is. It's just a factual question, and it is, and that's something I think that.
Have you ever talked with Senator Sanders about that?
I have.
What was that conversation like?
It was short. But yeah, we've talked about it. But I think it's a real problem.
Does he not share your view that he's responsible for the behavior of his supporters?
You know, I shouldn't speak for him. It's something he should speak for himself on. But I do think it's something that we need to reckon with in our political discourse in particular, because this is what politics is about, is to get out and put your ideas out there. People choose sides, people vote, people say, I'm holding a sign for her, I'm holding a sign for him. That is part of what we do. But what underlies that is a fundamental human decency and respect for each other. An understanding that nobody tries to put somebody's family at risk or somebody personally at risk because they disagree with you on the politics of it, because they see the policy different, because they don't support your candidate and they support some other candidate. No. And if we follow that same kind of politics of division that Donald Trump follows, that notion of, he draws strength from tearing people apart, from demonizing people, from saying, oh, those are bad people, and that's kind of how they draw their strength. It's not who I want to be as a Democrat. It's not who I want to be as an American. And to the extent I have any power to control that, I do what I can, and I call on others to do the same. And I think we have to have some accountability around that.
If that is a persistent problem in the movement around Senator Sanders, that was a problem that a lot of people complained about in 2016 around his presidential campaign, all the more so this year. And the senator, says that he's against it and says that he's condemned it. I've talked to him about it directly. But if it is a persistent problem and for whatever reason, he can't control it, or it's not being controlled by him, is there something else that the party could do about that? I ask because I think that it has an ongoing schismatic effect in the Democratic Party. I think in 2016, it made it very hard for the post-primary general election campaign of Hillary Clinton to get anywhere near success. And I think it's going to do the same thing, whether or not Senator Sanders is the nominee this time. I see it as factionalist and schismatic and injurious. And if he can't fix it, I don't know if there is anybody else who can.
So I think of this more as not the party fixing it or somebody else. I think of it more as, has the time come for us to just start trying to think more creatively about how to do this? Do you set up something, for example, from the campaign that every single day answers back to this with the authority of that person's campaign and says, we're not doing this. I'm flagging these. We don't like this. We don't want this. We don't want any part of this. We condemn it. How many times do I have to say this? I want to say it's let's work on doing this creatively. Can I give you just an analogy here?
Please.
You know how we talk about money in politics and we talk about the super PACs and the outside money and so on. People have always just said there's nothing we can do about it. It's too bad. When Scott Brown and I ran in 2012, remember, we developed a contract between the two of us and said we're going to keep super PAC money out of this campaign. And we figured out our own enforcement device and we made it work. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, but the point is, you don't have a creative solution until you sit down and try a creative solution. And if the first one doesn't work, move it aside and let's try the second. And if that one doesn't work, move it aside and let's try a third. But throwing up our hands and saying, no, we can't do this, that cannot be the right answer.
You're suggesting there could be a plan for this.
I think you're onto something.